One thing I've seen with the Nobledark versus Grimdark thing is I think a lot of Nobledark is focused heavily on the future in a lot of ways of the worlds. It's like there's this idea of like potential, and things might be getting better, things could get better, positive character arcs, like the changes that they go through in the story might not make things better right then, but they're developing in a lot of ways. Whereas you see Grimdark is kind of like characters go through arcs and changes, but it's never enough to change things on a large scale. And it's more about the present and dealing with this is what's happening right now, and things aren't going to change necessarily.
Hello folks, and welcome to Author Adjacent, a show about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney, and today I am sitting with Mike Cahoon, author of the Scion Conspiracy. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me back on.
Of course. Little do the people know we've actually been talking all evening, but, movie magic and all that, so
yeah.
Thanks. But last time we had you on the show, we were mostly just kind of shooting the shit, just talking about you, your author journey, your book, and your inspirations, all those lovely things that people tune in for author interviews. But today, we are going to be digging into the topics of Nobledark and Grimdark fantasy. I'm very excited to get into this because genre is one of my favorite topics. And why don't we start with Mike, how about you give us what makes a Grimdark fantasy a Grimdark?
So, as far as Grimdark goes, I would say Grimdark is definitely a vibe. It's focused on quote-unquote realness. There's obviously there's the aspects of it like violence, intrigue, just generally speaking, the morality of the characters, but I would say the biggest thing about Grimdark for me is a focus on consequences and the results of the characters' actions in a again, quote unquote realistic way of looking at things.
Yeah, it's a lot more consequence driven stories. And I think a lot of people translate that into that's grittier, it's more realistic, it's more brutal.
Yeah.
But I like the way you put it, that it's consequences. That is really what makes Grimdark Grimdark.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the flip side of that, Nobledark, its big focus is on pushing back against the dark with hope. Like, you may lose, you may experience those consequences, but you always try to do better. You try to be your best. Right. What would you say is a good example of a grimdark story?
The big one is the Joe Abercrombie stories. There's all of his books are kind of the textbook grimdark. There's Glenn. If you want to go real deep in there, there's Glenn Cook and the Black Company and all that stuff. And then, if you kind of want to go back a little bit older, I would say you kind of see the roots of Grimdark in some of the old sword and sorcery stuff like Moorcock and his Elric series. And even if you go further back than that, things like Conan and whatnot, it's kind of this, secondary redheaded stepchild to epic fantasy.
Yeah,
in a way.
It's a very popular redheaded stepchild, though. I will say that a lot of people like Grimdark.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those things where it's definitely seen a huge explosion of popularity in the past decade or 2 decades, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I've seen its rise for sure in the time of, since I've been reading too, it's gotten more and more popular. My first ever Grimdark story was probably Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns.
Oh, yeah.
And when I read that, it was the first time I ever read anything like that. And I was like, whoa, this is a whole different side of fantasy that I have not touched. Up until this point, it had been things like Redwall and R.A. Salvatore and
Oh
just
yeah.
all of those things. And then I read that and I was like, Jesus, this is a change.
I think most people kind of have that moment. You know, a lot of people get in, like you said, get into fantasy reading things like Redwall, like Tamora Pierce, you know, any of those classic old school younger kids fantasies. I mean, you got your Harry Potters, things like that, obviously. But you know, and then one day you just find this book, you find this other genre, this whole other side of fantasy that's completely different than anything else, and very much, you know, like you said, very real, very focused on realism and the violence and the brutal nature of what could happen in these worlds that we're creating. You know, the kind of, I don't want to say what probably would happen, but you know what definitely could happen.
Yeah, what has just as much of a chance of happening as the good endings that we often receive in other stories. Like that is the big thing that happens with like Nobledark stories is Nobledark is yes, we can have this dark and gritty world. There can be systems that are unfair and just trying to do the dirty things that happen in stories. But there are always people with hope that are like willing to push back that darkness. To me, the big difference between like Nobledark and Grimdark is Grimdark is often filled with characters where it's like the world is shitty and the shitty world has made shitty people. But
Yeah.
in Nobledark, it's like yes, the world is shitty and there are shitty people, but not everyone is shitty. I know I'm cursing a lot. Sorry.
No, no. I mean, trust me, I'm right there with you. Um, yeah, I mean, you know, I think for me, one thing I've seen with the Noble Dark versus Grimdark thing is, I think a lot of Noble Dark is focused heavily on, like, the future in a lot of ways of the worlds. It's like there's this idea of, like, you know, potential, and things might be getting better, things could get better, positive character arcs. You know, like the changes that they go through in the story might not make things better right then, but you know they're developing in a lot of ways. Whereas you see Grimdark is kind of like characters go through arcs and changes, but it's never enough to change things on a large scale, and it's more about. I think Grimdark is more focused on the present and dealing with what's happening. You know, it's more dealing with like this is what's happening right now, and things aren't going to change necessarily.
Would you say that grimdark stories also tend to be less epic? Like there are epic grimdarks, but I also have noticed a trend within them that in grimdark the story tends to be a little smaller, a little more personal. Like the consequences feel personal to me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's a huge part of it. I mean, I think a big part of why you fall into one subcategory of fantasy versus another is what your focus is on. You know, and this goes back to like you're talking about with Noble Dark or with any of the kind of brighter, you know, iterations of that. Your focus is on, you know, the future and the changing of the political structure or the world or the, you know, whatever as a whole. Whereas I think with a lot of Grimdark, it's very much focused on what these characters are going. It's a hyper focus on what these characters are going through right now, and you know, being in there with them, the nitty gritty, being feeling what they're feeling, and kind of seeing how what they're doing isn't necessarily able to affect the big things that are going on as much. You know, it's more of a. I think it's much more of a close in style. It lends itself to that close in style.
Agreed. Something we probably should have done earlier in the episode, but I'm just thinking to do this now. Your story, Scion Conspiracy, where do you think it lands on the Grimdark versus Nobledark?
Well, you know, these things are always a scale for sure, and I wouldn't say that it's as dark as something like I said before. It's not as dark as something like the Black Company, but I definitely wouldn't say it's noble dark or anything like that. I would say it's right there in that kind of middle ground because you've got characters that go through a lot of. I definitely have that. I try to have that tight end focus of being in on the characters and going through what they're going through. But I wouldn't say it's pitch black dark like some stories I've read are, for sure. So I would say a couple notches above that.
Okay. So, all right. So, about halfway, leaning a little towards the grim darker side is kind of the vibe I'm getting.
Yeah, I would say that's about right.
Well, it makes sense. And you are very much correct that it is a very character-driven story. I was talking about it a little bit in the last episode. Like, it feels very much that I am reading 5 different stories that weave together at the same time, and sometimes they come together and sometimes they come apart, but they can be brutal with the consequences and decisions that these characters make.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will definitely say the story I'm writing, Crownfall, falls more on the Nobledark side. I am definitely like, times are hard and things suck, but there are things you can do right now to improve, either if not now, in the future. I love the way that you put it earlier, that it's a focus on the future, and that's very accurate.
Yeah, I definitely think a lot of it comes down to, because I mean you can tell the same story and have it be grimdark or have it be Nobledark or have it be, I mean, even brighter than that. It's all about what you're talking about and what you're focusing on, because I mean you can look at the real world. I mean, you can, if you are looking at you can look at the same story from multiple different perspectives and get totally different visions on what's going on. And you can do that with a written story too. If you tell the story from one perspective, then it's this, very hopeful, very focused on the future storyline. But then if you go to someone who's not doing so well in that same situation, then suddenly it's a grimdark story. So
I want someone to take Joe Abercrombie's books and write a through line story that's Noble Bright just happening in the background. I would love for that to be a real thing.
I could see him doing that himself as like a joke, almost like as like a funny side story. You know, he's got that sense of humor, and I think he would find that hilarious.
Joe, if you're watching, the idea is free. Just bless us all with the story, please. Does your real world job as a firefighter, dealing with like high stakes and sometimes unforgiving situations, actually influence why Grimdark resonates with you more strongly than Nobledark?
I think having the experiences that are outside of what I would say is the majority of people's experiences, of having that, like you said, high stakes, violent, dangerous situations, definitely it feels more realistic when you're reading the chance and randomness and nitty gritty of Grimdark than when you're reading the the kind of hope and optimism and whatever of classic fantasy or of Nobledark or however you want to say it, epic fantasy. Those things definitely, as much as I enjoy them and I grew up reading them and I always love a good epic fantasy story. I definitely think as I've gotten older and as my, life experiences have kind of changed, those stories feel a little bit more like predictable, but also like they're not how it would actually go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sometimes you can feel the movie magic behind the story, like the hand of the author. We're like, well, it happened that way because I wanted to.
Well, it's also you watch you read books, you read some of these fantasy books and stuff like that, and you say, is that really how that would go in real life? You have the villain. The classic example is you have the big bad evil guy, and he's monologuing when he has the chance to kill the heroes for like 20 minutes. It's like, that's not how any realistic situation would go,
There's definitely enough time for a short rest, recover some health, and then kick some ass.
Yeah. But no, I mean, to answer your question, I do think it influences my opinion of especially how, situations in books would go. I definitely think that that those experiences have colored my view on that. Because it's like you don't have when you're really dealing with a situation like that. You're talking about high stakes, whatever. You don't have unlimited time. You don't get to make a mistake and then decide, oh, I'm gonna change things later. It's like you make a mistake and you have to live with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can see why your experience would draw you toward that kind of storytelling then. So in your experience then with writing Grimdark, and with what you know of Nobledark, how does that choice between those two or a different variety change how you handle character development?
As far as character development, with the Grimdark story, I think a lot of it comes down to it's you can develop the characters as much as you want, as much as they can be developed throughout the story, but it ends up being either circular or it's not enough. Because when you're talking about a grimdark story, the focus is on that kind of a little bit nihilistic, a little bit just the world is hard and it's not going to be changed because you suddenly find the specialness within yourself that doesn't have a practical effect on the world. you know so I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to when you're talking about writing a grimdark story. I think a lot of it comes down to remembering that you have to keep that weight of the world and ever presence feeling in the story. You never want to lose that sense that this is a real world or a realistic world where things are happening and they're beyond the control of your protagonists, no matter how much they might want them to be, or no matter how much they might change or, grow or whatever.
I think something that Grimdark does really well in both its characters and its setting is just capturing also the randomness of the world and reality of, like, sometimes shit just happens and it sucks. Despite everything that you did to prevent it or didn't even know it was coming.
That's just life. That is the way it is, and I mean, I would almost venture to say it's more heroic for people to keep trying in those circumstances than in a classic epic fantasy circumstances where things kind of just work out and everybody lives happily ever after.
When you have resistance and you keep trying, that's the good stuff. That's what attracts me to to Nobledark as well, though, because it is about it's about keeping that hope, about continuing to try, even though everything is in your way, because trying is the right thing to do, or trying is the thing that will eventually get you where you want to be. The reason I'm attracted to that is because that's kind of how I approach looking at writing and just this whole career that we're all trying to do here is I'm going to keep doing it despite any kind of effect that I may or may not have. And either one or two things will happen. I will succeed or I will die, and it will not be my problem anymore.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know what you mean. And I definitely think, I lean towards the less dark side of Grimdark because I do think that, the real world isn't completely hopeless, and I think that extreme of Grimdark is just that. I mean, it is a fantasy. There is, the world is not, no world is going to be completely hopeless. So I think, good Grimdark balances those things. Good Grimdark is about acknowledging that the world is hard and it sucks and it has its problems, but also, not being so terrible that there's no reason for people to go on this adventure or try to do this thing, because I mean, if you were, what would be the story then? You just misery porn, just watching people suffer.
That is a thing. Schadenfreude, people do love it.
I guess. I don't think that's why people read grimdark books, though. I don't think it's, I don't think it's exclusively about watching people suffer.
Yeah. What do you think it is that does attract people to Grimdark then?
The real world isn't hopeless, but it is hard, and watching people struggle having characters who go through realistic feeling struggles is more easy in a lot of ways to identify with, and creates a much, in my opinion, creates a much more compelling narrative. You know, you're not you're not dealing, or you're not reading about someone who is kind of, you're I don't want to talk shit about anybody or any kind of stories, but you have your classic farm boy stereotype where you have a kid who's the chosen one, who comes in and is just kind of good at stuff, and things kind of work out for him. They can make a lot of mistakes, and it never really tends to bite them in the ass that much. You know, it's like it might, but then it immediately gets solved pretty quickly, usually. So, and I think those stories have their place, and I think that there's nothing wrong with enjoying those stories. But I think for a lot of people, especially, adults who have lived through, I wouldn't say a grim, dark world, but, a world that definitely has its challenges, it might be easier, again, to identify with a story where there are some of those realistic consequences and realistic challenges, and people actually having to deal with problems that don't just go away and aren't just solved with, easy answers and someone casts a magic spell or something and things are just solved.
I think there's a lot of overlap between the two things that we're talking about and the two mindsets that we're talking about. Obviously, because like they both are dark. Have you seen the whole wheel of like Nobledark, Grimdark, and all that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So like a quick explanation for people who have no idea what I'm talking about. It is a wheel that is split into like 4 sections, and it's just, they flow one into the other. I don't remember the exact order, but it's like Nobledark, Grimdark, Grim Bright, Noble Bright, something like that. And it's about the different flavors of fantasy. And what we are talking about with like Grimdark and Nobledark, there is a lot of overlap. We're looking at the same problems from very slightly different lenses, it feels like. Or it's like the world sucks and you have to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is, again, like we said earlier, is what you're focusing on in that story.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could, I'm sure if you wanted to rewrite the story that I wrote, and you wanted to make it more Noble Dark, or even more, what was the other one? The Bright?
Noble Bright.
Noble Bright. You could. I mean, it's just a question of what you want to focus on, what characters which character stories you want to tell, all that. It just depends on it comes down to what story you're trying to tell and what your focus is on.
No, that makes a lot of sense. We've talked a lot about the worlds in these settings, but for the characters, how would you approach character morality in grimdark writing? And do you ever worry about like crossing too much into Nobledark territory when giving like your protagonist meaningful impact in your story?
I think a lot of it comes down to focusing on where the story needs to go, and letting the characters kind of go where they need to go, if that makes sense. For me, I feel like I am a big character writer, and so I kind of let the characters make their own decisions and then suffer those consequences, if that makes sense. I don't worry so much about crossing into any imaginary or like imposed different kind of stratification of the genre, because that's all. I mean, I don't want to say it's nonsense, but it's just something that people do for fun. It's like, this story is this story is that. I mean, they're all dark fantasy. They're all varying degrees of grim or bright or whatever you want to say. So, I think a lot of it comes down to just, like I said, letting the story go where it needs to go, and telling the story, putting the story first, not trying to adhere to any one ideological or, storytelling mechanic, anything like that.
Genres and stuff like that, this is very much like for fun that we are having this debate, because it is just dark fantasy. You are 100% right. That is the stories that we are telling. And it is enjoyable to do so. I do think that there are some trends that we can find in like the morality of these characters, though, per the subgenre that we're talking about. So correct me if I'm wrong on this one, or throw in your little 2 cents on this. But in general, I see Grimdark heavily emphasizes like anti-heroes who are surviving by compromising morals. And in Nobledark, I see a lot of like they're flawed but heroic figures who are holding to their principles despite the odds. And that is a big difference in characters between these two genres to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good. I think that's actually a really good like dividing line between those two kind of subgenres.
Yeah.
Which I never really thought about before. But yeah, no, that does make sense. It's definitely a question of what morals do your characters have from the start, and what are they willing to compromise on?
Yeah. So Grimdark is definitely like the most popular out of all of these like subcategories that we're talking about, especially in the past few years, like you were saying. Can you actually think of a Nobledark story off the top of your mind? Because the line is close. I have a few examples if you need some.
So I haven't read it, but I've heard that Greatcoats by Sebastian D. Castell is Nobledark.
I've heard of that one. Haven't read that one.
Yeah, I've gotten it recommended by a lot of people. And then The Faithful and the Fallen is, I would say. It's kind of more along those lines of, like you were saying, they have their morals and they're sticking to them despite the... I would argue that some of Sanderson's work is Nobledark. I mean...
100%.
Yeah, like Mistborn, I think, is very much like Nobledark. I mean, look at the setting and a lot of what's going on in that book, and it's very dark,
Oh, yeah.
But
like, I think of that... actually... it's a really old book. No, I'm not going to spoil it.
No,
Read
Mistborn.
Yeah. Okay, it's just like there's that one part. It's pretty early into the story where a ska gets pulled off into the mist and is just stabbed right there in the middle of everybody. And no one, like, it's obscured by the mists, but it is like dark things are happening around these characters. But they are also characters that are like trying to improve the situation.
Well, sort of, because you think about it, the book starts with them. It's a heist story. So, I mean, in another writer's hands, that story could have been much more grimdark and much less bright. Again, touching back on what we were saying before. If he had the characters make slightly different decisions, it could have been a very different story, a very dark story.
That story is really brutal when you think about it, because like the Inquisitors and everything, and how they walk around. Yeah. That stuff's wild. Man,
I think Sanderson, people like to pigeonhole Sanderson as this, hopeful, almost YAE when it comes to some of his work person, but I do think he doesn't get enough credit for creating some really interesting and dark settings, with a lot of really complicated ideas behind them.
Absolutely. Like, I would say Mistborn is a really good example of that. You get that a lot, especially in book 1 of Stormlight Archives.
Yeah.
A lot of the other ones get pretty dark too, especially with like Kaladin's mental health and stuff like that. But
yeah,
man, you're right. He does not get the credit he deserves for some of the darker aspects of his story.
I think when you put him up against some of the other really darker writers, he just looks really bright in comparison.
That is valid. He really does. I would say Sanderson is probably like the person that is pumping out the most Nobledark. Not like it is closest to the center, but like quantity of stories.
Yeah.
that is being pumped out as Nobledark stories. Sanderson pumps out a lot of them, and some of them do come out like Noble Bright. He never goes Grimdark, and he
No,
does
no.
have some YA, but he does put out a lot of Nobledark stories.
Did you read Warbreaker?
Yes, that is actually one of my favorites.
Yeah, I actually really, really enjoyed Warbreaker a lot. And I would say that's a pretty dark story. Again, when you come down to the actual, what's actually happening in the story and the setting and some of the stuff,
Yeah,
the ending, not to spoil anything, but, it gets into that noble dark more so than grimdark aspect. But the
100%.
world building is pretty dark.
Yeah, yeah, and it definitely ends on a noble dark note. Very like, this is not direct spoiler, so I think I'm going to be okay with this. Very like sacrificing for the greater good kind of situation,
Yeah.
which is very noble dark. Like the noble dark is very like the paladin that sacrifices himself to save the town. Like
Yeah.
that is very noble dark. Like there's a horde of horrible things happening and we've been trudging out in existence and he will sacrifice himself to save everybody. Done.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I like it. So many readers do love Grimdark for its realism and cynicism. But there are a lot of criticisms that it is very hopeless, and that's what a lot of people kind of really struggle with for reading Grimdark. I think you did a very good job in your story of really balancing that like gritty, unforgiving feeling of the consequences while not leaving the reader completely drained. How did you manage that?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to one thing I said earlier, which is that, the real world isn't hopeless. If you're seeking to tell a realistic fantasy story, you have to keep that in mind. You can't just say that everything is going to be terrible all the time and that there's no reason for these people to even have any kind of hope, because then what would the story be about? So I think when you're wanting to tell a grimdark story, but you don't want it to, like you said, be just a total emotional drain on the reader, you have to think about that people can make improvements in small ways in their world or in their community or in their direct sphere of influence. And you have to be able to find that balance between the characters trying their best and being able to make some changes, but still feeling like they're in a world that is vast and unforgiving and, is not concerned with any individual's morality.
I like the way you put that. Not concerned with any individual morality. Like, that is a good way of putting the world in that we throw these people in and see if they make it out.
Yeah, definitely.
So looking ahead into like fantasy trends then, some say we are shifting from a peak of grimdark toward a more noble dark, as people crave like more meaningful, like resisting the dark times kind of story in light of the world.
Yeah.
But where do you see your writing evolving into the future? Do you think you're going to stick to where you're at now, or do you think you'll get more or less grim on your dark?
Well, I think it is one of those things where I would like to write a lot of different stories over the course of my career. And I think that this setting that I've created for this story is very much a darker, more grim setting. The themes are much darker and things, but I do think it's good to kind of explore and challenge yourself and write outside of your wheelhouse. I would like to write other kinds of stories and other kinds of things as time goes on. And I think, just like variety is good in a lot of ways, I think variety is good for writers too. I don't think you want to get stuck in one way of doing things. I mean, unless you're, Joe Abercrombie or George R. R. Martin and you're making tons of money, then I guess you just keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah,
But
don't knock it.
yeah. But I mean, for me personally, I do have other ideas for other stories that are definitely fall into different subcategories and things like that. Yeah. What about yourself? Do you think you're gonna always?
I don't know if I would ever get into Grimdark myself. I do have like several Nobledark stories in my head. I do have a romance fantasy. I will not call it romantasy because it's not quite that far along on it, but I am a lover of romance stories. Like my favorite one is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which is a like very romantic with a fantasy base, and it's a romance first and foremost. So eventually someday I'll write a romance novel. So
nice.
Keep an eye out for that.
That's awesome.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to write sci-fi at some point. You know, I would love to write horror at some point because I've always been a big fan of the three, you know, my personal holy trinity of genres, which is sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. So I'd like to hit all three of those, you know, at some point.
Our trilogies, our trifectas are so close. I'm sci-fi, fantasy, and romance.
There you go. Then maybe that's where the Nobledark versus Grimdark kind of comes in. You know, it's that one little bit of difference.
You just got to trade out horror for fantasy or for romance or vice versa, and that's how you flip the switch on it.
Yeah, there you go. Were you asking about the genre and like where I thought the genre was going as a whole, or was that?
Oh, yeah, that was part of the question as well. I am also interested in knowing, like, do you have an idea of where do you think fantasy is going? Because right now, Grimdark is pretty top dog in a lot of people's minds as far as fantasy goes. Where do you see the future of it? Do you think Grimdark is going to like continue its reign, or do you think it's going to move aside for something more, or God forbid, less hopeful?
I don't know if you'd want to go much less hopeful. But as far as, you know, I think variety is good, and I think that you definitely are seeing a lot of subgenres of fantasy getting their moment, you know, in the spotlight. Things like cozy fantasy, you know, hope punk, things like that. I mean, when you look at the SBFBO books that just got announced, the ones that got into that. I mean, you've got things like Corbin Rook's Shadows of the Sunderlands. That's more of a hopeful, Nobledark thing. Eileen Kristen's In Ice We Steel. I think that was the name of her book. Yeah, that's again hope punk. But then you also, you know, you see Grimdark too, just like, you know, what I write. That book, Phoenix Rises, Dragon Soars, by Charlotte Salter. So, like, if you look at that list, there's a pretty big stratification of, you know, there's Grimdark. It's not all Grimdark. It's not all epic fantasy. And it's not all Nobledark. It's, you know, there's a wide variety of people of different things, and I think that's good. I think that's a good indication of where the genre is going as a whole. I think fantasy is kind of branching out, and every subgenre, to a more or less degree, is starting to find its audience.
Especially in indie, I will say I think traditional publishing is mostly on the same rail that it's been for a long time. But it does seem like the flexibility of indie authors to just come in and just write whatever gives rise to like the cozy fantasy and stuff like that. Like, we are seeing a lot of different stuff. You're 100% on that one.
I mean, you know, you can look at the you can look at KU or whatever, and you can see, I mean, there's such a variety of what's available. I mean, if you want to find, you know, Western inspired fantasy horror, you can find that. If you want to see, you know, anything really. So I think the good thing about being an author right now is if pretty much anything you want to write, there is an audience for. It's just a question of finding your audience.
I was talking to Rosaire Bushy a while ago, and he was talking about how it really doesn't matter what book you wrote or really how good it is. Just there are people that want to read your book, and all you have to do is find them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's 100% true. I mean, you can look at, I mean, we live in almost a almost like a gold rush, Wild West sort of age of the internet or of publishing, because you can go out there and stake your claim, and there's not really there's no one enforcing any rules. You can just go out. I mean, you don't have the publishing houses saying you can or can't do that. So, write whatever you want to write, and people, like you said, someone will read it probably if they hear about it.
Yeah, that's the trouble. You just got to make them hear you, and if they hear you, they'll be like, "Oh yes, pick me."
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I think that is a beautiful note to actually be ending this episode on. Mike, that was some great wisdom bombs you're dropping on there. Can you do me a favor? Oh, no worries. Can you do me a favor and tell the people where can they find you? Where can they find your books?
So I'm Mike Cahoon, author on all social media. So Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, Reddit, everything. And then, my books are on Amazon. They're in KU. And then, if you want to keep up with me, you can visit my website, mikecahoon.com, and sign up for my newsletter. But yeah, I'm all over the place.
Yeah. And we will absolutely have all that stuff linked down below. So very easy to find. All you got to do is scroll a little bit, and then you can say hi to Mike. He's a cool guy.
Thank you.
Just saying.
Not too bad yourself.
Thanks, man. All right, folks. And remember, until next time, let's be author adjacent together. Yeah. We did the thing.